Hello and welcome to the first of my videos on developments in Christian thought for OCR Religious Studies AS in Year 1, and this particular video is going to focus on Augustine's teachings on human nature. Now, the book goes into quite a lot of detail about Augustine's early life and influences. I'm not going to do so. Not because I don't think it's worth it, because it obviously is, but it's something that you can have a look at yourself. The other thing is that I'm not necessarily sure that it's going to feature that heavily in the exam, but you never know, so don't take my word for it. But to briefly mention, Augustine basically had two influences in his early life. One of his earliest influences was that of a group of people called the Manichaeans. Manichaeans were dualists who basically believed that the world is a battlefield between light and darkness. They also believed that suffering and evil were caused by a lower evil power. Now, their views were quite controversial, and those people who were Manichaeans could face prosecution and persecution for their views. So it's something that Augustine rejected fairly early on, but no doubt was influenced by it. Secondly, he came under the influence of a group of intellectuals called the Platonists. It goes without saying that they followed the teachings of Plato. So, as I have already said, this video is focused on Augustine and human nature. According to Augustine, human nature is profoundly influenced by an event called the fall, which I'll go into in a little more detail. But basically, Augustine says that before the fall, Adam and Eve lived in harmony. And during this time, the human body, will, and reason were in complete harmony. So if you like, a human being is a kind of tripartite being. It comprises of the human body, of will, and of reason, which are held in balance. And God created the will ex nihilo. Now, Augustine talks about the will quite a lot, so that's the thing to focus on. Basically, ex nihilo is from nothing. And the will can choose good, bad, to accept or reject God. The will is also synonymous with love, both self-love and generous love. As I say, before the fall, the human body, its will and reason were in harmony and had a harmonious relationship. They kind of balanced each other out. And this can be seen in the kind of relationship between Adam and Eve. Now, Augustine differs from other theologians by suggesting that Adam and Eve were married in paradise and that their relationship was one of friendship. However, as the Bible says, God commanded Adam and Eve to go out and multiply, so they were also sexual partners. However, this was secondary to their friendship. Friendship, according to Augustine, is the highest expression of human existence. Sex was therefore not lustful, but simply in order to reproduce. Now, after the fall, friendship becomes much more complicated and anguished, and in particular, friendship between men and women. Now, as most people will know, Adam and Eve found temptation and they took a fruit from the forbidden tree of knowledge. Now, Augustine says that this is because they desired to be like God, and that this kind of desire to be like God was as a result of the human trait of pride. Now, we might regard pride as being something, which it could be both good and bad. In Augustine's case, he definitely thinks it's bad. He says that Adam and Eve decided to experience good and evil by taking a fruit from the tree of knowledge, and the consequence being that they no longer could enjoy a harmonious relationship with God. In Augustine's version, Satan doesn't cause the fall, but basically provides the stimulus to disobey God. That's another important factor. Now, as I've said, Augustine considers pride, something which we might classify as disobedience, to be the cause of all vices. He says that because of this pride, because of what they have done, Adam and Eve now find themselves in a situation where the will is in a weakened state, and it's basically unable to control the body and craves two things: food and, most importantly, sex. Now, Augustine goes on to describe this as a divided will, or, as the ancient Greeks would call it, akrasia. This is a will that possesses rationality, but is also susceptible to weakness. We can probably, illustrate this by giving the case of, you find yourself on a Monday morning, the alarm goes off at 6:30. You have to get up because you want to get ready for college or whatever it might be, and you find yourself hitting the snooze button. The rational side of you would say that you have to get up. The irrational side, or weakened side of you, basically says hit the snooze button. In the case of Adam, and all men in particular, this has led to a condition which I've struggled to say, concupiscence, basically, uncontrolled lust. Now, not content with trying to defeat me with the first difficult word, Augustine, describes a post-Lapsarian world. Basically, post-Lapsarian is after the fall. In this world, humans suffer from original sin. This is denoted by a couple of things. The first is double death, and the second is the transmission of sin. Now, in terms of double death, Augustine basically describes that as the death of our relationship with God as it was prior to the fall, and also our own mortality. With regard to the transmission of sin, it basically suggests that sin is transmitted through reproduction, and so essentially babies may well be born without sin, but they have the capacity to develop sin, as Augustine will describe, as I say, later. In terms of free will, Augustine's views change from initially believing in free will through leading a life of Platonic rationalism, so note the influence of the Platonists, to the conclusion that sex, ignorance and death were too much for humans to overcome. They're basically susceptible to sex, ignorance and death. That can't be helped, and they will be influenced by that. This means that for Augustine, predestination meant that only a few people would be saved. Now, Augustine finds himself slightly troubled by the idea that he believes in predestination, because, as we'll see, most theologians like the idea of free will because it gives human beings the capacity to do right or wrong without God influencing those decisions. But Augustine says that humans should persevere in hope and faith, basically to achieve what he calls the summum bonum, the greatest good. So Augustine's final question is basically to ask how the damaged will can be saved. His answer is through God's grace. And he says that this is through the gift of Jesus Christ, whose death, or through whose death, the original sin of Adam and Eve will be removed. So that's essentially Augustine's theory. Now, as you can imagine, that's been written several hundred years ago. So the next question must be, how do we interpret Augustine today? For many Christians, they see the fall as not a historical event, but as an allegory of their spiritual and psychological life. They would say that this sort of description that Augustine provides is describing a journey which embraces both innocence and the harsh realities of life. You know, the fact that we are not perfect human beings, and that we are susceptible to temptation, the rejection of God, etc., etc. On a wider scale, it also shows how the human experience includes, great achievement, great achievements, and also, the horror of, say, for example, the Holocaust. However, you can imagine that this is not without its criticism. For the scientist Richard Dawkins, he believes that original sin is irrational and dangerous. As a biologist, he says that human corruption wasn't simply the result of two human beings. That's nonsensical to him. He also points out that Christianity is obsessed with sin, guilt, repressed sexuality, etc. Again, he sees these as kind of irrational hang-ups. And lastly, he says that the idea of God restoring human nature by killing Jesus is both irrational and seemingly sadomasochistic. Someone who would agree with Richard Dawkins' views is the psychologist Steven Pinker. He points out that religion and particularly Christianity have been responsible for a number of social ills, but they've now been subject to post-Enlightenment rationalism and what he would call the humanitarian principle. In other words, we kind of reject Augustine's views and have a much more rational perspective about the world. However, again, this view is not without its critics. In contrast, the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr pointed out that post-Enlightenment thinking has failed. Niebuhr died in I think about 1971 and lived through the Second World War, and he would point out that the horrors of the First, Second World War, of starvation, etc., amply illustrate the fact that kind of post-Enlightenment thinking has failed, and that people sort of ignore sin at their peril. The last thing to say about Augustine is that he's faced a good deal of criticism, that his emphasis on sex in particular has led to centuries of repression and guilt. Familiarity with with the teachings of Christianity would see that very often sex is a subject best avoided. However, in the 20th century, we saw the work of Freud. And Freud appears to have developed many of Augustine's theories about sex, despite rejecting Christianity and seeing Christianity and other religions as mere superstition. However, there are differences. Obviously, for Augustine, redemption is through God's grace, but for Freud, it's through psychoanalysis. So hopefully that will give a reasonable overview of Augustine's view of human nature. And my next video will be basically on death and the afterlife.